They trusted hedgerows, flak belts, and the slow arithmetic of column drills at Mortain in early August 1944. Rocket salvos from low Typhoons erased that rule in minutes. The shock was not the explosions, but the geometry. Armor herded into lanes, then cut open by weapons meant to punch ships and railway bridges. Subscribe, New World War II. Deep dive videos every day. Just after first light on the 7th of August, 1944, mist sat low over the bocage east of Mortain-Manche. On the Army maps, in the command post of the United States 30th Infantry Division, the square around Saint-Barthélemy and the ridgeline of Hill 314 had been penciled twice, once for the night's German push and once for the narrow hedged corridors where retreat would be impossible if the counterattack gained speed. The weather note in the operations log recorded overcast broken, cloud base low, the kind of cover German armored units liked. Hedgerows for the flanks, vapored sky against aircraft. The old protection was a composite of habits. German gunners trusted the thickness of the bocage, the irregularity of sunken lanes, and the doctrine that low cloud and dawn would blunt Allied attack aircraft. Columns were to move under this canvas, halt by hedgerows when artillery called, and resume once the sky turned fully gray. When artillery called. In that world, anti-aircraft guns were a deterrent more than a shield. The expectation was that fighter bombers would have little time to acquire, line up, and hit individual tanks or half-tracks in the maze. Rockets, if they arrived at all, were thought of as blunt instruments for rail yards and bridges, not for armored columns that could scatter into the green. The surprise mechanic did not come as a single weapon, but as an arrangement of procedures that collapsed distance between an observer, a map pin, and the fall of rocket salvos. Over the previous weeks, Air Vice Marshal Harry Broadhurst's 84 Group, under the Royal Air Force 2nd Tactical Air Force, had formalized the cab rank system along the front. Typhoon squadrons loitered in stacks at pre-agreed altitudes west. Typhoon squadrons of the Seine, fueled and armed for immediate vectoring by Army-attached air controllers on the ground. The controller call signs, rover parties, carried their own wireless sets, map boards, and a syntax of target talk that converted a hedgerow reference into run-in headings and burst points in seconds. On the Mortain axis that morning, one of those rover teams, attached to the 30th Division and relaying through a forward artillery net, marked the first set of lanes where panzers had broken contact with American outposts in the dark. A witness object from that hour sits on a single page, the 30th Division's after-action report draft, begun in pencil before noon. It notes the time by the phrase, shortly after dawn, lists the enemy as armored elements with accompanying infantry, and places the initial point at the western approaches to Saint-Barthélemy. Two notations underlined twice record Typhoons requested, and repeat runs authorized. The AAR's language is restrained and procedural, but one sentence shows the pivot. Air action concentrated on road junctions and hedgerow exits reduced enemy. Speed and cohesion, materially reduced speed meant rockets placed not at the center of a tank's silhouette, but at the point where a lane and a field met. The exits the drivers needed to clear artillery zones or change routes. The Typhoon, designed as a high-speed interceptor and recast as a ground attack aircraft, carried 8 steel rails under its wings, each rail mounting an RP-3 rocket with a 60-pound high-explosive warhead or a solid-shot anti-armor head. High-explosive warhead. The salvo rate was 1 pair with each press, or all in a ripple that emptied the wings in a handful of seconds. Pilots typically fired in pairs to walk a line across a lane. On the Mortain runs, the attack profile was short and violent. Descent from a few thousand feet to well under 1,000. A shallow dive to stabilize the site. A 2-pair or 4-pair release, then a hard brake, and had climbed back through the cloud gap. To the stack, the immediate tactical metric, recorded later in a range table margin and copied into a maintenance card bundle from a West Riding Squadron, read, effective lane saturation length, 80 to 100 yards per aircraft, 2 passes. Contrary to, per aircraft, the pre-war and early desert expectations about armored survival against aircraft. The rockets did not need to drill turrets to be decisive. The kill zone was the lane itself, a bounded rectangle defined by hedgerow banks, wheel ruts, and gate cuts. A pilot who put a ripple at the head of a column and another at the tail converted the corridor into a clogged, burning obstacle course. Tanks and half-tracks that were not hit directly would grind to a halt against wrecks and cratered banks. Recovery vehicles, if present, could not work under repeated run-ins. That was the geometry at San Barthélemy. A German commander trying to push through with speed discovered the lanes ahead and behind hammered into unusable shapes within minutes, while off-lane fields offered only angled, ditch-cut tracks that led to more hedges, and beyond them, American anti-tank guns aligned for flank shots. On the air side, the human lever was not only the group commander who authorized cab rank procedures, but the forward air controller who broke the previous rule of waiting for perfect visibility. A captain rank rover leader, working from a hedgerow knoll with an artillery liaison, decided to mark by talk-on using grid references tied to known farmhouse roofs and road bends rather than insisting on colored smoke, which would not carry under the damp early light. Smoke. His choice converted a potentially wasted hour into immediate action. Typhoons from numbers. 198 and 609 squadrons were queued to the first 2 exit points east of San Barthélemy, and then to a junction north toward Juvigny-le-Tertre. The air controller's log, another witness object, shows a tight cadence. Contact, heading, lane description in 2 phrases, release authorization, and a short post-pass correction for the next pair. The times are bracketed by artillery reports of halted vehicles, and by a single line, cloud base lifting slightly, that widened the window for repeated attacks. German anti-aircraft gunners, 20mm and 37mm pieces, with machine guns along carrier decks and half-tracks, did fire. Machine guns along their doctrine had value in fields and open roads. Set a band of tracer at the approach axis and force the pilot to jink, then hit him as he steadied. In the bocage lanes, that geometry reversed. The Typhoon's short exposure window, a few seconds from hedgeline to pull-up, compressed the German reaction time below useful thresholds. A range table, appended to a German battery's maintenance card, collected later and translated in a decoded signal summary. Notes: low approach, very brief. Guns cannot traverse fast enough in hedgerow cut. The same file mentions premature bursts. From tree strikes, a hazard for both sides that, on that morning, tended to disrupt the defender's tracer bands rather than the attacker's sight picture. By mid-morning, aerial reconnaissance photos, another witness object taken by a Spitfire from a tactical recce squadron and developed at a forward field west of Avranches, documented the effect line by line. At one hedged lane north of Mortain, wreckage blocked a span of roughly a field's length. At another, craters pocked the exit where a gate had been forced. The photos do not claim numbers of tanks destroyed. They show something more operationally valuable: lanes rendered impassable under time pressure. On a day where the German plan, under the codename Lüttich, required tempo to crack the American line and drive toward Avranches, lost minutes were as lethal as lost vehicles. Toward Avranches, a central paragraph in the United States Corps G2 summary put it in staff terms. Counterattack bled of speed, armor bunched under hedgerow cover. Opportunities for our tank destroyers increased. The decision that fixed the shape of the day was to keep the cab rank in place over Mortagne, even as calls came from farther east. Air headquarters weighed coverage for multiple sectors, but ground reports from Hill 314, where an isolated American battalion held through artillery and small arms fire, argued for continued suppression of German movement in the lanes feeding that ridge. The 2nd Tactical Air Force's operations log shows Broadhurst's group allocating additional Typhoon sorties in the late morning and redistributing fuel and rockets from a forward strip near B, 5 at Le Fresne-Camilly to fields closer to the Cotentin. A production and transport tally from a maintenance wing, the 4th witness object, lists pallet counts of RP-3 rockets offloaded at a temporary dump the previous evening. The arithmetic of how many salvos could be flown that day is penciled at the bottom in a corporal's hand. The number is not large. Rocket stocks were finite and reloads slow, but married to the lane geometry, it was enough. On the ground, German testimony and post-war compilations would emphasize the same sensation American infantrymen recorded at the time: the sound and the slashing flight path of the rockets, the sudden eruption at lane mouths, the way a column's will to push evaporated when the space ahead became metal and smoke. But the forensic record that morning needs no subjective color. It shows timestamps, headings, and lane names. It shows that the first rush lost its shape within the first hour after dawn and never regained it. The American line bent in places, especially south of the ridge, but did not break. There was, however, a second rule that morning, one that the air-ground system had not yet broken. Rockets did not guarantee tank kills, and pilots admitted privately that gunnery against moving armored points in the bocage was as much about suppression and blockage as it was about direct destruction. A rocket projectile range card kept by a ground crew chief in number. 193 Squadron lists dispersion patterns at typical release speeds and angles. The drawn ellipses are wide. Against a moving tank belly down in a sunken lane, a direct hit was as much craft and chance as calculation. The system's real weapon was not a single warhead, but cumulative denial of mobility, the enforced stoppage that let artillery and anti-tank guns finish the work. By noon, the weather improved enough that the cab rank did not have to fly entirely by instruments between runs. The cloud ceiling lifted, and controllers could attempt smoke at some junctions. Yet, even without colored signals, the method from the earliest passes had done its work. Find the lane entrances, put salvos there, and return before the next packet of vehicles could nose through. A decoded signal summary pulled from ultra-intercepts, processed the previous night, had tipped Allied staffs to the general axis and timing of Lüttich. That intelligence set the stage. What ruptured the old rule in the lanes themselves was procedural speed, codified and rehearsed in the weeks after the breakout from the Cotentin. When dusk arrived, Hill 314 still held, ringed by spent shells and ration wrappers. The 30th Division's draft AAR added a line about air support. Constant through day. Neutralized enemy movement along Mortagne-Saint-Barthélemy-Juvigny axis. On another field, ground crews turned Typhoons for morning, checking rails and swabbing, wiring looms, initialing maintenance cards to certify contact breakers. Across the hedgerows, German gunners counted remaining belts and looked for positions with better traverse. The old protection, cloud, hedgerow, lane discipline, had failed them. The contradiction lay in a single, terse sentence scrawled in the margin of a British controller's log. Same method worked again on a different axis yesterday. The authorization trail did not begin at Mortain. It ran backward through a month of improvisation, formalized into policy, and forward through a week of logistics that made repeated rocket salvos possible over a tight front. In late July, after the American breakout from St. Lo and the opening of Operation Cobra, 2nd Tactical Air Force staff circulated a short directive that treated fighter-bomber time as a pooled resource rather than a flight-by-flight commodity. The paper, stamped at group headquarters west of Caen and re-stamped at several forward wings, codified 3 elements: a standing cab rank over priority corps sectors, an air-ground language that reduced a hedgerow and a road bend to a grid, and a language that reduced heading, and an ammunition and fuel plan that pushed rockets and high-octane petrol into temporary dumps closer to the front than maintenance officers would have preferred in June. The directive's copy retained in a wing file, one of the witness objects for this act, shows the small frictions that had to be resolved. Who owned the loitering time? Whether artillery nets could carry air control voice traffic? How to reconcile Army? Grid references with the airfield's map overlays. Marginal notes in 2 different hands suggest the compromise. Keep the rover parties physically collocated with the artillery liaison teams, and issue them a second wireless set to avoid choking the fire control net. The rollout looked mundane on paper. Rocket pallets arrived at a Normandy beachhead via coaster and motor launch, offloaded by cranes into lorries, and driven along marked routes to assembly points on farmers' fields turned into dumps. A short ferry manifest dated to the final days of July at the Mulberry, off Arromanches, lists crate counts for RP3 tails and heads, rails, electrical leads, and packing wool. Each line item bore a destination code letter for an airstrip, B designations chalked on the side panels of the trucks, so that wing supply clerks could cross-check the day's receipts with the sortie plan. On a second page, a corporal's pencil added, "Weather window expected early August, hold to west dumps." That decision meant rockets were on hand when Mortain triggered calls for sustained salvos. It also meant maintenance crews whose first months in France had been filled with cannon belts and bombs were now threading wires, checking contact breakers, and leaning over aluminium rails in the rain at dawn. The doctrine and the device worked because the limitations were acknowledged and managed. The Typhoon was not a sniper's tool. Pilots learned to think of rocket fire as shaping rather than precision, and controllers learned, sometimes the hard way, that the right target was not the tank in the middle of the lane but the gate mouth, the hedge break, the junction where 3 lanes converged. The hedge break, explaining the rocket in plain language, began with its physics. A steel tube, solid propellant, a warhead in the weight class of a small artillery shell. It left the rail with a rough start, tipsy until the fins bit enough air, and then flew true enough to cross a hedgerow lane within the span of a hedgerow lane. In training tables recorded in an 84 group pamphlet and annotated during July by flight commanders, release parameters were set to minimize the wobble. Low dive angle, consistent speed, pairs fired in a short ripple to draw a line rather than place a point. When crews did this, and when controllers picked the right place, hits were not the only metric that mattered. Mobility denial, measured in minutes, and vehicle spacing was. Reliability was good enough to be decisive and poor enough to punish laziness. A maintenance compilation from a West Riding Squadron, assembled after the Mortain Week, counted rockets that failed to fire off the rail, rockets that left the rail and failed to arm, and rockets that left and armed but wandered under marginal release conditions that left and armed. The shorthand is blunt. Out of every 10, a shade fewer than 8 behaved as expected on a typical day, and when rails or leads were soaked or bent by rough strips, the dependable fraction dipped. The range crews compensated by testing leads obsessively and swapping rails with early signs of arcing. In the cockpit, pilots compensated with volume and geometry, pairs, short intervals, and a second run if the lane still offered a clear line. Authorizations at the human level mattered more than forms. At Mortain, the rover captain's choice to talk on without smoke had already broken a minor taboo. Elsewhere along the front, air controllers and artillery battalion liaison officers agreed between themselves to treat junction neutralization as an artillery mission with air in the role of guns, a mental shift that sharpened the tempo. Air in the role of guns. The chain of consent ran up to Air Vice Marshal Harry Broadhurst and across to American Corps commanders who accepted a British-led air grid over their sectors, because the effect was visible in front of their infantry within minutes. A decoded signal summary from the Allied intelligence pool, another witness object for this act, explained why this speed mattered. German orders for the Lüttich counterstroke emphasized concentration and dusk or dawn movement along specified lanes in the Mortain sector. Pre-positioned air that could answer within minutes turned that concentration into the very vulnerability it needed for surprise. Case Study 1 was a defense hold built on the Mortain method, but in a different micro-terrain. On the 10th of August, German units still probed east of the original axis, trying to pry open lanes leading to the Avranches bottleneck. South of Hazanti-Lair-du-Arquet, American engineers had cut culverts and laced road shoulders with mines to funnel traffic into predictable lines. A rover team attached to a tank destroyer battalion logged a call at mid-morning when scouts reported half-tracks nosing through a hamlet north of the Saloon. The weather note reads, "Broken cloud, gaps opening." Typhoons already stacked over the 30th Division were slid south by 1 degree on the grid and given a heading to a Triple Fork junction. By 1 degree on the attack profile mirrored Mortain. Pairs against the road mouths, then a second pair at the far exit to turn the fork into a trap. The measurable effect appears not as a kill list, but as times. The engineer company added a line to its log. Fork denied 15 minutes. Then, a few entries later, fork still denied. TDS engaged flank at 150 yards. By afternoon, the push had run out of room. The hold, attributing credit to artillery fires and air denial rather than to a single decisive strike, shows the system working not as spectacle but as clockwork. Case Study 2 was a bottleneck with a terrain twist. Near Saint-Lambert-sur-Dive, in the middle of August, as the Falaise encirclement tightened, a German column attempted to exit east along a sunken road that crossed a shallow stream by a stone bridge and then climbed a ridge between orchards. The lanes here were narrower and the hedges thicker than around Mortain. The air controllers, working with Canadian and Polish armored units pressing in from the north, placed their pins not on the bridge itself. Stone would shrug off near blasts, but at the 2 orchard gateways leading away from the far end. Aerial reconnaissance photos taken later that day and processed at a forward film van, another witness object, show the result. The bridge unmarked, the gate lines pocked, and vehicles jammed behind the first orchard wall. Gate lines pocked, The measured effect was not vehicles destroyed, but time. The column was still there at dusk, which meant it was under artillery HE and observed small arms fire when it tried to move after dark. The next morning, the lane was strewn with abandoned transports and a few tanks with empty fuel tanks. The twist here was doctrinal. By not aiming at the stone, Air preserved the bridge for Allied use while still denying the exit. Case Study 3 was a doctrine pivot at the Seine crossings. In the third week of August, German forces falling back from Normandy needed to make the river in organized groups. Allied plans demanded the opposite. At Mantes and Vernon, bridges and ferry sites had become magnets for both sides. The Typhoons' role pivoted from lane denial in bocage to approach denial on open roads that ran across floodplains, where hedges did not define corridors. And across floodplain, controllers solved the target problem with different witness objects. Radar plots from a mobile ground control unit fed bearings to stack leaders, and aerial recce from morning sorties had identified the handful of approach roads high enough to matter. On the 23rd of August, near Vernon, a rover party guided a section onto the western approach lanes by describing a church spire and a right-angle bend before the floodplain. The Typhoons rippled pairs along the bend and then along the levee entrance, while medium bombers struck the far bank. And then along the levee end. A bridgehead report that evening recorded crossings secured by Allied infantry and, crucially, a much thinner stream of German vehicles reaching the east bank than anticipated. The measurable effect was the ratio of wrecks and craters to open surface along 2,000 yards of approach. Controllers admitted later in training notes that open approaches demanded better sighting and steadier runs than hedgerow lanes. But they also noted that the cab rank principle still compressed call to impact into minutes. German adaptations followed quickly and could be read in the same files. Columns spread their vehicles deeper, extending the distance between tanks and half-tracks to reduce the chance that a single ripple would block more than one. Half-tracks, night movement increased, and engineers cut ad hoc bypasses around cratered lane mouths. Black traps, short ambush sites where multiple guns were massed to create a sudden cone, appeared on likely run-in axes, and decoy smoke pots burned at junctions to confuse a talk-on description. A German signals intercept translated in late August mentions movement only by single vehicles under tree line. A miserable, slow method that conceded tempo but preserved pieces. Against these adaptations, the Allied system changed less than the opponent might have expected. The cab rank remained. The rover parties stayed on artillery nets, and the aim points shifted from obvious junctions to the exits of the tree line itself. A Canadian Wings after-action summary from late August notes that when columns dispersed, pairs of Typhoons were split to work two exit points at once, and that when smoke obscured a bend, controllers used pre-registered bearings from church towers and mill ponds to reconstruct the geometry. The price of this persistence was not small. Flak traps did take aircraft, and crews who flew the same headings repeatedly over 2 days learned to zig when habit insisted on a straight line. Mid-act, a contradiction forced refinement. On a day of heavy rain in the second half of August, the cab rank over a sector east of Argentan held for hours, orbiting in a milk churn of cloud, while the rover party tried and failed to talk a section onto a lane behind a ridge. Rockets were soaked, rails arced. One aircraft returned with 2 loaded rockets that had refused to leave the rails. A maintenance card clipped to the squadron diary, another witness object, records the engineer's fix: dry the leads, reseat the contact springs, and swap rails between aircraft to isolate the fault. The operational lesson was more delicate. Controllers wrote in their logs that going for talk-on without smoke under very low cloud could produce more orbit time than impact time. Very low cloud could. In response, Group Headquarters issued a supplement. Under overcast, below a set ceiling, controllers were to concentrate aircraft on pre-registered junctions rather than chase mobile points they could not see. On paper, the rule looked like a step back toward set-piece thinking. In practice, it prevented hours lost to circles in white murk, and it saved fuels and tempers for the next window when holes opened. A second side effect surfaced at Hill 314 itself. The denial of lanes that protected the American battalion also cratered the local road network so thoroughly that engineers needed 2 days after the crisis to cut through the wreckage and lay fastenings for ambulances and supply trucks. An engineer company's log complains, in tidy script, that several hedgerow banks were shaved by near misses that collapsed the soil into ditches. A civil affairs liaison flagged a hamlet where a gate blown apart by a pass had left the livestock wandering into the lane and complicating the post-battle traffic. These were small frictions in the scale of a campaign, but they mattered to the men holding the ridge. The refinement here was to reserve rockets for lane mouths outside the immediate friendly resupply routes once the crisis passed, relying on cannon fire alone within the inner ring. At the level of memos and production, the system's unmasking is clearest in the quiet facts. More rockets brought forward, more rover parties trained, more airframes kept serviceable, and a more explicit agreement between Army and Air over who could cancel a cab rank to shift coverage. A training circular dated to the 3rd week of August, copied for distribution at several forward strips, distilled the improvisation into 5 simple lines: loiter near, speak in grids and landmarks, aim at exits, return quickly, and do not empty the wings into the same rectangle if the first pair has already blocked it. The circular included a schematic, an aerial photograph with pencil arrows and tiny X marks at gate mouths. Below it, a line in capital letters warned that an overeager second pass into the same cratered exit risked cutting a later Allied route. It was the rare admonition that earned as much assent from the ground as from the air. By the final days of August, the paperwork of victory and exhaustion overlapped. Production tallies from an RAF ordnance depot at a Normandy field, yet another witness object, showed rocket stocks trending downwards as the pursuit toward the Seine drew aircraft away from their original forward dumps. Lorry mileage figures rose, recorded in careful cursive by drivers who knew they were carrying the one piece of kit the pilots asked for by name. Squadron diaries showed airframes flying more hours, with Napier Sabre engines ticked and reticked by fitters who wrote their initials in the corners of the cards with pencils ground down to nubs. And in the Army files, AAR pages accumulated that treated air support as a dependable variable. At Mortain on the 7th and 8th, at the Forks south of Saint-Hilaire 3 days later, at Saint-Lambert in the middle of the month, and at the Seine in its last week, the language converged. Lanes denied. Movement broken. Exits struck. Tempo reduced. German doctrine did not collapse everywhere. Tempo reduced. Columns that moved by night. Single vehicles at long intervals and flak belts on open approaches still got through in places. Where the hedgerows broke, in the open grain fields approaching the Seine, rockets were harder to place on a meaningful geometric center. A Luftwaffe fighter cover, rare by August but not vanished, occasionally lanced a cab rank and forced a pause. Yet the pattern held in enough sectors to bend a campaign. A rule was now broken. Cloud and hedgerow no longer guaranteed armored movement in daylight, and even dusk and dawn carried risk where a rover net and a cab rank were within reach. The act closes with the system's bare skeleton in view. Authorization that treated time aloft as a shared pool. Logistics that pre-positioned steel tubes and petrol close enough to matter. Controllers who spoke the lanes into coordinates. Controllers who accepted that accuracy would live in pairs and rectangles rather than single points, and ground commands that understood lane denial as a clock, not a spectacle. The contradiction remained in the margins. Wet rockets, soaked rails, flak traps that found the habitual run-in, craters that later slowed friendly ambulances. But those were refinements to be made, not refutations. The evidence, across memos, manifests, maintenance cards, decoded signals, and recce photos, showed a system that began as an improvisation on the Cotentin and, by Mortain, had become a doctrine with its own geometry. 5. Act 3. Outcomes and Legacy. The day after the first Mortain salvos, the American line still held its ragged ribbon from St. Barthélemy to Hill 314. A Corps Situation Report dated the 8th of August, 1944, reduced the outcome to sparse sentences. The German counterstroke had been blunted. The Avranches corridor remained open. Engineer units were repairing lanes for resupply. In the margins, a staff officer added short arrows toward road nodes reclaimed during the afternoon. That night, under intermittent rain, litter bearers came off the ridge by routes that engineers had reopened with picks and fascines. The geometry that had punished the German columns, hedge-confined exits struck by rockets and covered by artillery, now worked, with care, for the defenders. Ambulances made the last stretch by footbridge and hand trolley where craters pressed the roadway to the ditches. In a civil affairs notebook, a line catalogued the practical aftermath. One hamlet without a functioning well, one churchyard wall collapsed by blast, livestock contained again by rope and improvised hurdles. The immediate air outcome is preserved in a wing operations ledger that counted sorties and annotated their purpose. For the 7th and 8th, the line beneath number. 198 a number. 609 Squadron shows repeated entries of lane exits and junction denial, with only a handful of armored point attempts noted beside them. The ledger's totals mattered less than the distribution. Salvos were not wasted on spectacle. Each entry implied minutes purchased for the ground line to reset its shape. A parallel maintenance packet logged rockets expended against stocks received. The arithmetic is penciled, not typed, but the direction is clear. Ordnance officers would be asking depots by the end of that week for more RP3 pallets to hold the pace. German files from the same window, gathered after the action and translated, weigh the cost in ways that align with the Allied records. A regimental narrative written that autumn, when the war had turned elsewhere, described Mortain not as a single defeat, but as an erosion of timing. The phrase, tempo lost under air attack at exits, appears twice in 4 pages. A battery's field sketch, stream, hedgerow, lane, includes fat charcoal X marks at 2 hedge gaps where rocket pairs had landed that morning. Beside them, the officer wrote, "Bypass impossible, ditch deep." The gunners had not expected rockets to be aimed there. Doctrine had trained them to meet guns and bombs, not salvos that turned a lane mouth into a cratered gate. Operationally, the effect cascaded through the second week of August. With Mortain contained, 1st United States Army continued its lateral movement to close the base of the German salient, while formations of the Canadian First Army and the Polish Armored Division pressed from the north toward Falaise, Trun, and Chambois. The Typhoons method, refined in the bocage, followed the battle onto more open ground, where roads ran straighter and hedges thinned. The more open ground, controllers carried forward the same mental model: deny the exits, deny the approaches, work in pairs to draw lines where the enemy most needed arcs. A Canadian Corps intelligence summary for the middle of the month connected the dots without flourish. Air-ground coordination in real time had reduced the possibility of rapid regrouping by armored elements withdrawing east. That sentence sits beside a reconnaissance film strip showing a road east of Saint-Lambert, with 3 gate mouths darkened by craters and a line of abandoned vehicles bunched behind an unmarked stone bridge. Bridges were kept intact for Allied use. The exits that fed them were the focus of salvos. As the German retreat hardened into a fight for crossings on the Seine, the outcomes could be weighed in crossings secured and crossings denied. The outcomes could Vernon, a British bridgehead, stood. At Mont, Allied units forced a passage. The Typhoons' role in these river battles is sometimes overshadowed by the medium and heavy bombers that cut rail yards, and by the engineers who threw pontoons under fire. The files do not encourage that simplification. Rover logs list church spires, bend angles, and levee ramps used to talk on run-ins where floodplain roads pinched into higher ground. A bridgehead report at Vernon, dated the 23rd of August, recorded that the volume of enemy vehicles reaching the far bank was lower than expected, attributing the shortfall to denial of approach lanes west of the river between noon and denial of approach evening, a phrase that reads like an echo of Mortaine's ledger lines. The cost to the air crews is present in the same pages that record their effect. Several squadrons lost aircraft to flak belts hastily massed at predictable run-in lines, and to the occasional interception by German fighters that still appeared in ones and twos when weather and fuel allowed. A wing diary entry notes a pilot who did not return from a second pass. A maintenance card lists a Typhoon written off on landing after a rocket hung on one rail and then fired during the flare. After a rocket hung on the system had proven itself, but it was never frictionless. The refinements issued in late August do not repeat a pass into the same rectangle unless an exit has reopened. Vary headings over likely flak traps. Conserve rockets within the inner ring of friendly resupply. Grew from these losses and from engineer. Complaints about post-battle mobility. The ground outcome in Normandy's final August days is measurable in prisoners counted along the roads north of Argentan and east of Falaise, in transport columns burned or abandoned, and in the speed with which Allied infantry and armor reached the Seine in multiple places at once. A British staff review of the campaign's end in Normandy credited air-ground denial methods alongside artillery concentrations and armored envelopment for the compression of German options. The document did not claim that rockets won the pocket. It claimed, more modestly, that the method repeatedly transformed plausible armored movements into stalled queues where other arms did their work. The difference, if set against the doctrine familiar from the desert and the steppe, was the compression of call-to-effect time. In the bocage or on river approaches, minutes, not hours, determined whether a column slipped a net. Minutes, not hours. Strategically, this compression altered resource allocation for both sides. Allied planners, realizing that a reliable denial tool could be summoned against road exits and junctions within minutes, held fewer reserves back to counter panzer thrusts, and pushed more weight toward exploitation. German commanders, recognizing that daylight movement along predictable axes would be struck at the places they must pass, shifted to night and to dispersed intervals that preserved vehicles but surrendered tempo. Decoded signals summaries in late August and early September captured the adaptation. Orders to battalion columns to move singly along tree lines, to hold under cloud, but avoid hedged exits at dawn, to set hasty flak pairs at likely exits at dawn, church spires to bend run-ins. These measures avoided clustered losses, but yielded the initiative. When the race to the Seine became a race into Belgium, Allied formations entered with momentum unbroken. The legacy of the Mortain method is not only in the Normandy file boxes. Post-war doctrine absorbed the lesson that a fast, delegated air-to-ground tasking system could break an old battlefield rule without inventing a new device. Cab rank and rover evolved into forward air control and air liaison systems that spoke in brevity codes instead of prose, but the bones remained. Spoke in brevity code. Pilot training syllabi in the later 1940s and 50s taught weapons employment concepts that resembled the Typhoons' geometry. Suppress in shape, strike exits and choke points, measure effect in minutes and movement rather than in dramatic tallies. The apparatus changed. Jets replaced saber-engined fighters. Radios shrank. Maps gave way to more precise plotting. But the doctrine of compressing call-to-impact time under a single set of coordinates kept its shape. The rocket itself, the RP-3, had a more complicated legacy. It was field-robust and simple, and it taught ground attack aviators to think in salvos and lines rather than single points. Aviators to think in. Later, unguided rockets would extend the reach and tighten the dispersion, but the skepticism written into those west-riding maintenance cards never entirely left the lineage. Training ranges after the war kept the paired release habit, and weapons schools emphasized that unguided rockets were shaping tools first, destruction tools second, unless a pilot accepted the odds and closed to distances where flak and small arms grew deadly. Instructors cited Normandy's orchard gates and hedgerow mouths because they captured the core insight. Make the ground an obstacle, not a graveyard, and let the rest of the force harvest the tactical result, not a graveyard. The administrative legacy sits in quieter corners, in logistics pamphlets that urged prepositioning of specialist munitions near likely sectors, in staff colleges that used Mortain and the Seine to teach coordination problems between air and artillery nets, in civil affairs manuals that flagged the secondary costs of cratering post-battle routes that friendly medics and engineers would need hours later. One British circular from the late 1940s reproduced the aerial photograph of a triple fork junction with pencil X marks at each exit and a bold warning beneath. Strike where the lane becomes the road. Leave the road if it will be ours by evening. That line carried not triumph but restraint, and it echoed the engineer complaints written in tidy script during those August days. There is also the legacy of evidence. The witness objects that anchored the story, the AAR pages, the ferry manifests, the maintenance cards, the decoded summaries, and the reconnaissance photos, shaped how later analysts argued about cause and effect. They favored claims that could be timed and mapped over claims that relied on memory alone. When a post-war debate reopened about how many tanks rockets truly destroyed in Normandy, the argument that won professional respect did not rest on large destruction counts. It rested on those photographs of blocked lanes, and on those logs that captured minutes lost and columns stalled. The lesson, repeated quietly in staff papers for decades, was that a system can be decisive without theater. For the German side, the Mortain shock ceded a different inheritance. Field notes from late August and September urged commanders to treat hedgerows and tree lines as cover only for single vehicles and only while moving at a crawl, to expect air every daylight hour within range of a core front, and to assume that the first and last vehicles in any lane were the points most likely to be hit by rockets. That doctrine preserved units in the short term, but turned an army built on concentration and shock into one that shuffled and seeped. On concentration. When the war moved beyond Normandy into open country, the habit of diffusion could not keep pace with Allied motor columns, and the Luftwaffe's thinning presence left flak belts to fight alone against aircraft that now ranged farther and refueled faster from captured strips. By the time Allied units crossed into Belgium and the Netherlands, the cab rank had bred variants. Some controllers worked directly from armored half-tracks with masts and extra sets. Some integrated with artillery fire direction centers so tightly that air and guns alternated on the same coordinates without pause. A Royal Air Force training note from September preserved a pithy restatement of the method's essence. Be there, speak plainly, strike the exits, return quickly. It is the same cadence heard between the lines of the Morton logs. Across the channel, in ordnance depots, the production tallies of rockets sank as new theaters pulled attention, and as the air threat dwindled to pockets. Yet the shelf position that rockets had won in the summer of 1944 did not vanish. It waited in peacetime inventories and in revised syllabi for the next war's forward air controllers and their pilots. The material remnants faded slowly. Hedgerows regrew where they had been shaved. Orchard gates were mended. The collapsed churchyard wall at one hamlet was rebuilt with stones that still bore faint lines from blast chips. The road surfaces healed into smooth gray strips, and the farmers' fields erased trench scars in 2 winters. On Hill 3, the 114, the grass covered over the slit trenches and the shell holes, and the view down into the Mortain lanes returned to how it had looked before a rover set-talked Typhoons onto 2 exits at dawn. A visitor could stand there and see only the geometry in abstract, lines of green and gray, bends and forks, hedges and stone. The rule that died in those lanes, that cloud and hedgerow at first light guaranteed armored movement, did not return. There is a final image in the archives that does not announce itself as a conclusion. It lives in a reconnaissance sequence taken after the Mortain fights and misfiled under a general heading. The frame shows a lane mouth, its hedgebank rebuilt, a wagon passing with hay. No wrecks, no craters, no code words in the corner. A single figure walks along the ditch line carrying a tool handle across a shoulder. The lane curves and vanishes between 2 trees. The camera has nothing more to say. The lesson hardens not in the spectacle but in the absence of it. A new rule had replaced the old one. When an army aligns observers, maps, and aircraft under a shared clock, exits and approaches become the critical ground. And for those who depend on lanes, minutes can be as lethal as steel. 6 months later, in a training hall far from Normandy, an instructor drew 3 short lines at a road fork and shaded the tips. He told his class, in paraphrase recorded as a note, that the fastest way to halt a column was to close the places it must pass. Around the world, and in later years, pilots and controllers would inherit that geometry without knowing the names of the lanes at Mortain. The witness objects would sit in files. The debates would continue about rockets and their counts, and the field itself would return to hedges and hay. Oh, the broken rule stayed broken, until the next war taught someone to break it differently,